Byran Stevenson is here. He is a public interest lawyer who has dedicated his life to fighting racial discrimination in the criminal justice system. His efforts have also focused on putting a spotlight on the legacy of slavery in America. His nonprofit, the Equal Justice Initiative, has saved 125 death row prisoners from execution. It has also won a landmark Supreme Court ruling that held mandatory life without parole sentences for minors is unconstitutional. The organization plans to open the first and largest memorial honoring the thousands of victims of lynching in the United States that will happen next year. The project includes a museum that will explore the road from slavery to the current era of mass incarceration. Both will be located in Montgomery, Alabama. I am pleased to have Byran Stevenson back at this table. Welcome. When you went to Montgomery as a young lawyer, I mean, did you see unfurling this career that you have had? Did you burn with the fire to do what you have done?
I didn't see everything that would come. I grew up in a poor rural community where I saw the anguish of racial exclusion. We lived in a black settlement and we couldn't go to the public schools, and I know the way people internalized that hurt. I saw people humiliated by segregation and Jim Crow. And so when I got to Montgomery, that desire to see things change was very real. But I had no idea that, things would develop as they did. I went there at a time when, you could still have a conversation with Rosa Parks, who had moved to Detroit but would come back. And there were these icons of the civil rights movement in my ear. But I've been hopeful that we could get to the point where we could talk about these issues in a broader context. We've had some success in the criminal justice area. We still have a lot of work to do, an enormous amount of work to do. And we've had some setbacks. But I've now realized that we've got to talk about these issues more broadly if we really want to see the change.
Did you want to have a big life?
No. I just wanted to make a difference. I would be very happy.
That's one definition of a big life.
Well, it is, but, I've been happiest when I can go to the prison and spend time with clients, standing up for people in the courtroom, making the kind of arguments that I think need to be made to kind of point to the humanity of every human being. But I didn't expect to be in a situation where we had to talk more nationally and internationally about these issues.
Are we approaching a time in which there's developing a consensus on criminal justice?
I think we have approached a time where there's a consensus that we have too many people in jails and prisons. People on the right, people on the left, all recognize we've gone too far.
Yeah, it's coming from both sides of any political divide.
That's exactly right. I think everybody realizes that putting people in prison for life for simple possession of marijuana or for writing a bad check is an inefficient use of government resources. It's excessive, it's punitive, it's harsh, it's unnecessary. We're not actually advancing public safety when we have hundreds of thousands of people in jails or prisons who are not a threat to public safety. And we went from $6 billion on jails and prisons in 1980 to $80 billion last year. So not only are we not helping in the public safety space, we're undermining funding for education and for health and human services and for a lot of those things that the rest of society needs.
In so many areas of endeavor, we are a shining light. But not in criminal justice.
Not in criminal justice, and I think that's in part because we've allowed ourselves to be a little distracted by the politics of fear and anger. We have allowed ourselves to buy into narratives rooted in fear and rooted in anger. And when you're afraid and when you're angry, you will actually tolerate abuse and unfairness and inequality. And in the 1970s, political candidates started saying, let's be tough on crime. And nobody said, no, we shouldn't be tough on crime. They all competed with one another over who could be the toughest on crime. And it created a political culture where both Democrats and Republicans were looking for ways to show their toughness.
It was also law and order.
Law and order and tough on crime. And that we exhausted our ability to kind of just focus on people committing violent crimes that threaten public safety. We went into other spaces. We said drug addiction and drug dependency, that's not a health problem, that's a crime problem. And we didn't do that for alcoholism. We said alcoholism is a disease. And it wouldn't cross our mind that if we saw someone we knew who was an alcoholic going into a bar to call the police. That would make no sense. But in the drug context, we said, no, those people are criminals. And we've now sent hundreds of thousands of people to jails or prisons. But that phenomenon, I think, is related to this history of racial inequality.
Right.
I think if we had done better in recognizing the problems of the genocide when Native people were slaughtered by the millions, if we'd actually developed a consciousness that says, oh, wait a minute, we made a mistake. We, through disease and famine and war, have created this horrific consequence for Native people in this country, we would have thought differently, but we didn't. We just went past that genocide, and then we enslaved people for centuries. And while we ultimately recognized that slavery was wrong, we didn't really account for all the damage that was done. We never talked about the ideology of white supremacy that emerged during that time period. We didn't actually try to repair all the damage that was done by enslaving human beings. We fought the Civil War.
And making them property.
And making them property.
And not human.
And not human. We fought the Civil War, and then shortly after that, we abandoned any effort at recovery through the collapse of Reconstruction. And that led then to this era of terrorism and lynching and the trauma that was created. And so we've not been very good at owning up to these mistakes, and as a result of that, they keep manifesting themselves.
Are you suggesting that somehow what happened in South Africa, with Truth and Reconciliation, never happened in slavery, and therefore we never have come to grips with it?
Oh, I don't think there's any question about that. I don't think anybody can argue that we committed ourselves to truth-telling about the legacy of slavery. It just didn't happen. We did the opposite. We didn't hold the people who were accountable for slavery responsible. We didn't actually insist on recovery and repair for emancipated people. We abandoned those who were enslaved. We allowed them to sink back into this condition of second slavery. We tolerated convict leasing, this horrific era.
So, but let me ask in a locker room way. So what about Thomas Jefferson? Is Thomas Jefferson, who owned slaves, therefore should be taken out of American history, or he should be what?
Yeah, no, I don't think we should ignore our history.
Do we say that this was a what?
Well, I think we have to.
Man who gave us the.
Yeah, I think there are obviously things that people during that era did that were wonderful and respectable, that should be honored, that we have to acknowledge as great and remarkable. But we should also say it is a cloud over the founding of this country that we couldn't see. The inhumanity, the inequality inherent in slavery. Doesn't mean we're condemned. It doesn't mean we don't have something to be proud of. It does mean, though, we have to ultimately own up to that. At some point, we have to say slavery was horrific, and we need to be thinking how we free ourselves. And what you can't do, which is what we have done, is ignore it. Pretend it didn't exist, pretend it wasn't that bad, because you actually add to the victimization when you deny that narrative.
I want to understand you clearly.
Sure.
I mean, what's the definition of pretending it doesn't exist?
Pretending it didn't exist is evident when Michelle Obama gets up at the Democratic Convention and talks about enslaved people building the White House, and everybody says that's wrong, that's outrageous, that's crazy. Pretending it didn't exist is when we say, oh, slaves had it good, they were well fed. Pretending it doesn't exist is what you see when you come to the American South. I don't know that as many people appreciate the hardships of slavery as there should be. That is, I don't think we've done a very good job of actually detailing the hardships and the struggle of slavery.
So what's necessary to do that?
Well, we have to begin telling the story. I mean, you know, it's only a couple of years ago that a film called 12 Years a Slave was produced, which was probably the first time we saw on the big screen an honest accounting of slavery. We had hundreds of other films that told a different story about slavery. And again, I can't ignore the fact that the South is littered with the iconography of the Confederacy. We actually have romanticized this period of slavery. We've said it was a great time. We have honored the architects and defenders of slavery. And that suggests that we don't really appreciate what we were doing. It would be unconscionable for someone to say, let's make Adolf Hitler's birthday a national holiday. It would be unconscionable for someone to say, let's make Osama bin Laden's birthday a national holiday. But yet, in many states, we are celebrating these architects and defenders of slavery with it as if there's nothing comparable.
Okay, but tell me about the museum.
Sure.
And what you believe it can begin to do.
Yeah. The museum will be an 11,000 square foot area. It's situated 100 meters from one of the most prominent slave auction sites in the American South. It's situated 100 meters from the Alabama River, where a dock and rail station transported thousands, tens of thousands of enslaved people. It will introduce people to the hardships of slavery. There'll be slave warehouses. You'll hear the voices of enslaved people through holographic images. We're going to get slave narratives and use that language. We'll talk about African people being kidnapped and the horrors of bondage. We'll have artifacts that present some of that. We'll have virtual reality films where you'll experience what it was like.
You were there.
Yeah, put you right there on the train when enslaved people were being forced from the upper South to the lower South, with all of that anxiety about whether they would be able to keep their children or their children would be taken away from them. And we'll move from that slavery experience into the era of terrorism. And we'll try to get people to understand.
And terrorism is the lynching.
Is the lynching. And what we want people to understand is that lynching wasn't mob justice, it wasn't mob violence. These lynchings took place in communities where there was a functioning criminal justice system, but black people weren't deemed good enough to be a defendant. And people weren't lynched for accusations of crimes. Elizabeth Lawrence was lynched because she was an older black woman who was targeted by children who were throwing stones at her, and she chided those children. And because she chided those children, their parents and their community got angry, and they came to her home and they lynched her. A family in Lowndes County was lynched because the pastor said that the lynching that took place the day before was wrong. People in Mississippi were lynched because they bumped into white people running to the train station, and these social transgressions is what created this lynching. And that meant that for black families, when your son came home and said, I might have laughed inappropriately at someone's joke, I might have bumped into someone, you had to have a crisis conference where you decided whether to send your loved one to the north or not because of this fear of lynching. And it was so traumatizing. And we sent people out of the American South with this trauma, with this fear, as refugees and exiles. And now they sit in urban communities where that trauma has been unaddressed. And so for me, you have to understand that. And so we're going to have in the museum a console that has the most comprehensive data on lynching in the country, where people can see about their communities and their histories. And then we're going to talk about the era of segregation in a slightly different way. We're not as interested in the celebratory stories about what heroic people of color did, Dr. King and Rosa Parks. What we're interested in is the intensity of resistance to integration. We want people to see the signs that were put throughout the South that restricted where black people could go. We want them to see the statutes that legislative bodies created, because we tend to demonize the architects of racism. We want all racists to be members of the Klan, and it would be convenient if that's where they all live, but that's not where they live. We had members of the legislature creating these documents and these doctrine to burden people of color. And until you understand the intensity of resistance to integration, you cannot understand why we are still dealing with racial bias in this country. If you understand this history, you'd be foolish to think that the Civil Rights Act or the Voting Rights Act was sufficient to end this history of racial inequality. You'd recognize that people are still going to be trying to undermine the rights of black people.
You said, I am persuaded that we really won't eliminate the problems of discrimination in the criminal justice system, in the education system, and in the employment system until we change the narrative of racial difference that we have all accepted.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that we are all actually infected by this narrative. I think it's wrong what we're doing to our children.
And what is the most important thing that we have done in a positive way to change the narrative, in your judgment?
Well, I think
so that we can look at that as a lodestar.
Yeah, I think we've actually made progress on issues like domestic violence. You know, 50 years ago, domestic violence was seen as a joke. The Honeymooners was a comedy show where people would joke about, men would joke about hitting their wives. There was something that we tolerated about the violence and abuse that women suffered in the home. And then that narrative began to shift. And we still have a long way to go. But now you see sports leagues that are actually taking action against athletes because it's becoming unacceptable to tolerate, to look the other way with that kind of violence. That's a shift in the narrative. I think in the environmental context we've seen that. There was a time when we thought spraying, cans and consuming fossil fuels was the only way that we could use energy. And now we've realized that's destroying the planet, and we're shifting. We have recyclable bins. We talk about green energy. We talk about doing things that are going to protect us. That's a shift rooted in an understanding that the narratives that we grew up with about what's healthy and acceptable have to change. We haven't done that in the racial justice space. We haven't. We've looked for shortcuts. We said, oh, if we let Jackie Robinson play baseball, we'll be okay. If we let black people play basketball, that'll be okay.
If a black man is elected president,
we'll be okay. And those shortcuts don't work. You can't have a magic pill on this.
Has this president done all that he can, in your judgment?
I don't think the president started his term wanting to be a black president,
right,
trying to address these issues. I think he actually wanted to be the opposite. I think as he's persisted in this presidency, he's actually recognized that he is being perceived as a black president, and we have to talk about these issues more broadly. So he's done some things, particularly here in the last couple of years, that I think are really positive. But I actually think all presidents should be doing more on this issue. I also think we can't look to our presidents to solve this problem.
Exactly right.
We've got to have our governors and our mayors and our communities and our school boards and our educators.
And our grassroots.
And our grassroots being active on this. This is not something that one person can solve. And that's why we're starting with a museum,
right,
and a memorial in a community with the hope that we can bring people to these places.
Take a look at this. What's this?
So that is the memorial. It's this massive structure which sits on a rise in Montgomery, Alabama.
Why Montgomery?
Montgomery.
You're from Montgomery?
Well, Montgomery was the cradle of the Confederacy. Yeah. It was where, in many ways, resistance to ending slavery. It was a place where terror was widespread. It was the birthplace of the Civil Rights Movement. I think Montgomery's a perfect place for this because, if anything, we've got to tell these stories in the spaces where they've happened, and we've got to do it in places where there's going to be some resistance. But
and was there any resistance to this idea in Montgomery, Alabama?
Well, we're just kind of getting public about it, so we're in the early days of that. I'm sure there will absolutely be some resistance, but those columns are all representative of thousands of people who were lynched.
How many columns?
There's going to be 800 columns for every county in America where lynching took place, and the names of lynching victims will be engraved on each column. And you'll go into this place, and the floor will sink, and the columns will rise, and you'll stand underneath these suspended items.
What's that?
Those are jars of soil collected from lynching sites. We started a community remembrance project where we have gone into communities and invited people to go to lynching sites where they collect soil and they put it in a jar, and the jar has the name of the victim and the date of the lynching, and then they reflect on that. And we've been collecting these for quite some time, and it's been really empowering to see community members respond to this opportunity and to get closer to this legacy of lynching.
That is a different view.
Yeah, and what's important, what we're going to do is we're going to duplicate each of the columns inside the memorial. So those 100 columns with counties and names of lynchings are going to be duplicated, and they're going to be outside of the memorial. And we're going to ask people from the counties to come and claim their memorial. We're going to build them, we're going to construct them, but they are actually to be placed in counties all over this country, because we think that while this national memorial will sit in Montgomery, it ought to exist all over the country. And I think it will be important for people in these communities to own up to this history. And I hope that teachers and churches and leaders will say, you know, we need to go claim the monument for the lynching victims from our county and put it in our county. And that kind of activism, that kind of responsiveness gives everybody an opportunity to participate in this. And the other thing, we're putting up markers at lynching sites, and one of the things that I'm hoping will happen is that when we put up these markers, that police chiefs and sheriffs will come to the marker dedications. And I want those sheriffs and police chiefs in their uniform to say, I'm sorry that the people wearing this uniform did not protect you 100 years ago, 80 years ago. I'm sorry they didn't do that. And then I want them to know they have an opportunity to say, I'm sorry for what they didn't do, but I'm here to tell you I will protect you. I'm wearing this uniform now, and we're here to protect all the people of this community. It won't cost money, it won't take time, but it could have an enormous impact in creating more trust between communities and law enforcement.
Are you one of those people that think that we need to have a real conversation about slavery and a real conversation about where we are in race relations?
Oh, I do. I just don't think we should facilitate it at some made-up conference. I don't think it can be mandated. I think it needs to happen. We put up
markers. But then how to do it is the question.
Yeah, well, I mean, you know, again, 3 years ago, when I was in Montgomery, we had 59 markers to the Confederacy in downtown Montgomery, and hardly a word about slavery. We put up these markers about the slave trade, and there was tremendous resistance to that. But we put them
by
up
the city council or people like that?
By the Alabama Historic Commission, right, oddly. But we got them up, and now I see young families, white families, rural families coming into town, and we're sitting next to the Hank Williams Museum, slightly different demographic that goes to that museum. But when they come out, I'll see young kids stop at that sign. And you'll frequently see the parents trying to move them along, but they won't, and they'll spend 10, 15 minutes at that sign, and it's probably the first time that family's talked about slavery ever. But I think it's an important conversation to begin. If we can change this resistance, this denial culture, then I think there are a host of things that we can gain and learn. And I don't think, you know, it's about just doing something hard. It's about liberation. It's getting to the point where we're not so compromised. We're not so constrained. We bump into each other a lot in this country. It doesn't take much to create distrust or race. And that's going to continue until we say the things and do the things we need to do. It's not touchy-feely. It's just honest recovery. It's how you heal. It's how you recover from historic trauma and mass atrocity and violence. You see it in Rwanda. That society is recovering, and it wouldn't happen if people said, we're not going to talk about the genocide. You see it in South Africa. You see it in places around the world.
I mean, I'm asking this question because I want to know the answer. Did we simply say we're not going to talk about slavery, or we just didn't talk about it?
We said we're not going to talk about it. I mean, in the American South, people said, you know, we're going to feel bad about ourselves if we think about ourselves as being the losers of the war. We're going to really be in trouble if we let these emancipated people show us that they are our equal. And so they constructed a legal, cultural, political, and social world that reinforced the narrative of white supremacy, which was the narrative that created slavery, and people in the North tolerated that, and then we allowed that to persist. So yes, it was in my view, conscious decision to not talk about these things. I mean, President Woodrow Wilson, you know, heralded birth of a nation, and so we're not going to talk about these things. And during that period when lynching was going on, the Congress said, we're not going to talk about that. And during the early years of segregation and the fight for integration, people said, we're not going to deal with that. And that's been our history.
I didn't know that aspect of Woodrow Wilson's life until the last year.
Yeah, and that's part of the story. That's part of the story. We haven't actually asked questions about people's culpability, their complicity, with regard to this narrative.
Incarceration.
Yes.
Joe Sullivan, one of your clients, called you, said you're like a father to him.
Yeah. You know, I feel one of the best parts of my work is the relationships I can create with people who have been too often abused and neglected, who've lived in the margins of society. You know, I represent a lot of people who've made some terrible mistakes, but they're incredible human beings. They have so much potential. They have so much capacity. They have so much to give, and yet we've condemned them in ways I think is tragic. And particularly young kids. I met Joe. Joe was one of our young kids. He was 13 when he was wrongly convicted and given a life without parole sentence, and then terribly abused in prison. And so a lot of those young people are just desperate for something human to hang on to.
And that's who you are.
Well, I try to be. I want my clients to know I care about them, that they have value, that their lives mean something. I do believe that we're more than the worst thing we've ever done. I believe that for everybody, not just my clients. And so that means saying to them, look, just because you've lied doesn't mean you're only a liar. Just because you've taken something doesn't mean you're only a thief. Just because you've killed, you're not only a killer.
I asked you at the beginning whether, you know, when you went to Montgomery, did you have any sense of what your life, how your life would unfold, and what you might be doing. Here's a quote from Just Mercy, your book. After working for more than 25 years, I understood that I don't do what I do because it's required or necessary or important. I don't do it because I have no choice. I do what I do because I'm broken too. I'm broken too. Yeah. I think when you get close to suffering, when you spend a lot of time with inequality and abuse and trauma and neglect and incarceration and execution, it will break you. But I also think that it's in brokenness that we understand the power. Has it broken you?
It has. It has. You know, I've been broken long before that. I mean, it's funny. My great-grandmother was the daughter. My grandmother was the daughter of people who were enslaved. My great-grandparents were enslaved. And my grandmother was in my ear all the time talking to me about slavery. And I used to think, why are we talking about slavery, Mama? And I started my education in a colored school, didn't go to a public school. And I went to high school, I went to college. When I got to Harvard Law School, I didn't want people to know that my great-grandparents were enslaved. I didn't want people to know I started in a colored school. It wasn't that I was ashamed of it, but I was afraid it might diminish me. I thought it would make me seem broken, deficit. And then I started doing this work, and I saw the constraint and the resistance to equality and fairness. And then I realized that part of the solution is to own up to that history. And now I want everybody to know I'm the great-grandson of enslaved people. I want everybody to know I started my education in the colored school, because if they see something of value and hear something of value, and they know that it is rooted in this broken history, then maybe we can begin to think differently about what it means to stand up for the broken. I actually think the broken in our society have a lot to teach us about the way the mercy works, the way grace works, the way justice works. And so acknowledging that in myself is partly honoring all of that struggle. I now realize that there's power in this legacy that has nurtured me despite slavery, despite lynching, despite segregation. And I think if people can overcome slavery and overcome lynching and overcome segregation, then we can overcome mass incarceration, excessive violence. We can overcome police violence. But not by pretending that we'll be there. We'll know it when we don't think that there is a presumption of dangerousness and guilt that gets applied to black and brown people. We'll know it when we're not as preoccupied with the race of offenders when we hear about a sad crime. We'll know it when we've actually changed the landscape and we've made it safe and acceptable to talk honestly about these histories. We'll know it when we honor things that are honorable and we talk forthrightly about the things that are dishonorable, like some of our mistakes.
For all that you have done for so many people, I have this feeling that they have done an equal amount for you.
Oh, absolutely.
Because they have given your life.
Absolutely. No, I feel really privileged to do what I do. I feel deeply moved and honored by being able to stand up for people and speak for people. I was told one day that, you know, if you really want to make a difference, sometimes you have to stand when other people say sit down. You have to speak when other people say be quiet. And I heard that and thought that sounds like a really challenging thing to have to do. But when you know who you're standing for, when you know who you're speaking for, it doesn't feel like a burden, it actually feels like an honor. And I feel very honored to represent people who I think, whose humanity, who I think has been denied or diminished.
Thank you for coming.
You're welcome.
Byran Stevenson, I suggest several things for you if you will listen to my small advice. One is I did a piece for 60 Minutes with him, and you'll see part of that. But also, he has given one of the great TED conference talks, which has been seen by millions and millions and millions of people. His book is called Just Mercy. And Jeffrey Toobin, a friend who was at this table last week, writes a profile of Byran that was in the issue of the New Yorker magazine that's on your newsstand now. He raises important questions for all of us that need to be acted on and need to be addressed and need to be heard loud and clear. And I'm honored to call him a friend. Back in a moment. Stay with us.